Hi, I'm Bill Gaither.
Hi, I'm Bill Gaither.
Bill Gaither turned 90 years old, and the gospel music world did not send a card. Voices came pouring in from every corner of a genre that stretches across generations and continents and thousands of small churches that the Christian music industry never once thought to visit. And what arrived was not polished tribute content, carefully worded for public consumption. What came flooding in was love, specific and personal and earned, from people who knew him not as a figure in sacred music history, but as the man who called them on a Tuesday afternoon when they needed it most and stayed on the line as long as it took. 7 decades of ministry sit behind the name Bill Gaither, alongside more than 300 sacred songs written with his wife and creative partner Gloria Gaither, and the Homecoming video series, or one of the most successful projects in gospel music history, with millions of copies sold and a devoted audience that has followed it since the early 1990s. A touring operation carried sacred music into arenas and auditoriums across the country for decades without losing its footing. These are the numbers, the documented achievements, the things that end up in awards, show recaps, and Songwriter Hall of Fame citations. And yet the people who gathered to celebrate this birthday were not talking about any of them. Every voice came back to the man who answered the phone. The Collingsworth family gathered and sang, their voices threading through each other, the way voices only do when people have sung together long enough that harmony stops being a decision and starts being a reflex, and when what Kim Collingsworth and her family offered Bill was not performance. Gratitude moved through every note, the kind that comes from people who understand a debt personally and still feel it years after the fact. The Collingsworth family has long been part of the world Bill built in Christian music, and their voices on that birthday tribute carried a warmth that no studio session could have manufactured, because singing, as Bill has always understood, is not decoration, but direct communication between human beings. Sandi Patty, one of the most celebrated vocalists in Christian music history, reached for a word that surfaced repeatedly across tribute after tribute, and that word was coach. Not director, not executive, not visionary, though all of those would have applied. The distinction between coach and the other titles matters more than it might appear, because a director controls the room while a coach reads it, adjusts to it, believes in his players before the players believe in themselves. After every homecoming concert, Sandi and Don Peslis would leave the venue talking about the game Bill had just called, marveling at how he brought in a particular singer at exactly the right moment, how he felt the room shift and moved to meet it. Having known him since she was 28 years old, Sandi made those observations at 48, which meant 2 full decades of watching him work had not softened her conviction, but sharpened it considerably. Franklin Graham sent his own message, and in it, he traced 70 years of faithful ministry end to end with the kind of attention you only give something when you genuinely understand what it cost to build. The friendship between Bill Gaither and Billy Graham across those years was not a professional alliance, not networking dressed up as relationship, but genuine connection maintained across decades and distance and the ordinary wear of busy, demanding lives by 2 men who had both decided that friendship deserved the maintenance. Franklin Graham, who serves as president and CEO of both the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association and Samaritan's Purse, does not offer birthday tributes casually, and the warmth running through his words made clear this one originated somewhere real. 32 years ago, Bill handed one person the opportunity to begin producing what would eventually become the Homecoming video series, and 16 years ago, that same person joined the tour itself, and both of those numbers deserve a moment of actual stillness because they reveal something essential about how he operates. Walking alongside the people he invested in came naturally to Bill, and he kept walking through whatever the road brought, year after year and project after project. Not as a manager monitoring an asset, but as someone who genuinely cared what happened to the people who had trusted him with their careers. Mark Lowry, whose humor and heart have made him one of the most beloved figures in Southern gospel for decades, wished Bill another 90 years, carefully noting this would bring him to exactly 180 years old, which is both mathematically accurate and precisely the kind of thing Mark would say. Laughter ran through so many of these birthday messages, and none of it was incidental, because one of the things that has always separated the Gaither world from other corners of the Christian music industry is that it never confused seriousness with solemnity. Joy and depth have coexisted in that world since the beginning, and a room full of genuine laughter has never been a room that lost its reverence. The friendship between Mark Lowry and Bill Gaither carries the specific texture of people who have made each other laugh through long travel days and difficult concerts, and all the unglamorous reality that lives behind the curtain of any touring operation. Ernie Haase, a founder of Ernie Haase and Signature Sound, and one of the most recognizable voices in contemporary gospel music, put something into words that several other speakers had circled without quite landing on, saying simply that Bill is the youngest 90-year-old he knows. Tracking the energy Bill continues to bring to new projects and new artists and new possibilities makes that assessment genuinely difficult to argue with, because something in him has refused to calcify the way most things do over time. Curiosity stayed. Engagement stayed. The question he keeps asking is what comes next, not what has already been accomplished, and that quality, more than any single song or production credit, probably explains why the career has lasted as long as it has. A scripture verse arrived as a birthday gift, Colossians 3:16, St. Paul's instruction to let the word of Christ dwell richly, to teach and encourage one another through psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with grace in the heart to the Lord. And the person who offered it said it reminded them of Bill constantly. Hearing it in that context makes it almost impossible to hear it any other way afterward, because that verse describes not just what Bill Gaither does, but what he has organized his entire life around. Not the performance of faith, not the industry of faith, but the actual dwelling of the Word, letting it take up permanent residence in the work and the relationships and the daily choices that accumulate over 90 years into what looks, from the outside, like a legacy. One word carried more weight than almost anything else spoken across those gathered messages, and that word was obedience. A woman whose career had been shaped by the platform the Gaither organization extended to her said she was a beneficiary of Bill's obedience, and that framing shifts the entire story, because the reach of his influence across Christian music and sacred song did not spread simply through talent, though the talent is real and thoroughly documented. The talent became available to other people because Bill said yes to what he was called to, even when yes carried a cost, even when staying comfortable would have been so much easier than stepping forward one more time. Father appeared again and again in those birthday tributes, not as metaphor and not as polite exaggeration, but as the most precise description people could find for what Bill has genuinely been in their lives. Grown men and women with their own careers and families and hard-won wisdom described Bill Gaither as the father they needed when they needed one, the guide who arrived at the right moment and stayed long after most people would have moved on. And no industry award exists for that. No chart position or gold record or Hall of Fame plaque that captures the specific weight of having been that person. For someone at the moment, it mattered most. And yet that is what surfaces most consistently when people are given the freedom to say what he has actually meant to them. Not the songs, not the concerts, not the business, but the man who picked up the phone. What Bill and Gloria Gaither understood in the 1960s, beginning with songs like He Touched Me and Because He Lives, was something the Christian music world has spent decades trying to rediscover, which is that sacred music never had to choose between artistic quality and genuine feeling, that a song could be beautifully constructed and emotionally honest at the same time, and that the best worship music was never the music that tried the hardest, but the music that was truest. Because He Lives came out of a real moment when Gloria sat with a newborn baby during a season of national turmoil and held on to the only thing that actually held, which was the resurrection, and that is a life being lived out loud in song. More than 500 recordings of that single hymn exist across dozens of languages, finding their way into sanctuaries and hospital waiting rooms and country churches in places the music industry never bothered to map. Birthday messages came from everywhere, from Christian music artists at every level of their careers, from ministers and producers, and old friends who had known Bill for 30 and 40 and more years. And the striking thing was not the range of people who contributed, but the consistency of feeling running underneath all of it. Every voice carried the same thing, not admiration from a comfortable distance, but love up close, from people celebrating someone who had known their names and called their numbers and believed in them personally before they had given anyone sufficient reason to believe. Bill Gaither built something that lasted not because he occupied the most talented position in any room, though genuine talent came with him, but because he treated the people around him as though they mattered absolutely and completely. And they did, and they knew it. 90 years old, more than 300 songs, 70 years of ministry, decades of homecoming videos, finding their way into homes and hearts of people who needed exactly what those videos offered, which was the feeling of sitting among people who love the same things you love, singing the songs that carried you through the hardest seasons of your life. What he built was not just a catalog or a company, but a community, a place within gospel music and Christian worship where people who cared deeply about sacred song could gather and feel less alone in that caring.